Hi, everyone. Welcome,
Hello.
welcome. I'm just going to give it a couple minutes, just another minute or two to let everybody come in. Nice to see some familiar names in the attendees. Really wonderful that some of you have been coming along to several of our events. That's wonderful.
It is a brilliant event that you've put together.
Thank you. Well, thanks for being part of it. Really looking forward to this afternoon. Hello,
Yeah, my pleasure.
everybody.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. All right. So I think we will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much to everyone for being here with us this afternoon at the Stay at Home Festival. So this event is on writing the body with Haleh Agar, and we're absolutely really excited to have you here and to be talking about this today. So this event is going to explore female embodiment and specifically representations of the body as a site of vulnerability as well as empowerment as well. So I think it's going to be a really fascinating discussion. My name is Carly Brown. Some of you might have seen me around at some of the other events. I am a poet and an author and one of the organizers of the festival this year. This event, as you might know, was meant to be chaired by Pragya Agarwal. However, Pragya unfortunately couldn't make it today, so I'm stepping in to fill that role for you this afternoon. So just to let you know about that as well. I do have a list, though, of topics and discussion points and wonderful things that we're going to be talking about with Haleh, which is going to give us the opportunity to learn a little bit more about her and about her work and how it relates to this topic of bodies and embodiment and writing about the body. There's also going to be a Q&A at the end of this session. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A box and we will get to those when we get to that section of the event. That would be really great. So be thinking if you have any questions and feel free to pop them there. So I'm going to introduce you first to Haleh and then we will get started with our conversation. So Haleh Agar is is a novelist, short story writer, and essayist as well. Her debut novel, Out of Touch, is published by W&N Hachette in 2020. Her short story, Not Contagious, was highly commended by the 2020 Costa Short Story Award. She is part of this year's judging panel for the London Magazine's Short Story Prize, and she's currently working on her second novel as well.
Hi,
So,
everyone. Lovely
very
to be
pleased.
here.
So happy that you could join us. So I wanted to get started by just talking a little bit about the body as a subject in your work. So the body is often a focus in your work, whether you're exploring things like illness or sexual intimacy as well. So can you just tell us to start a little bit about what inspires you in looking at the body as a central topic in your writing?
Absolutely. So for me, writing is a tool through which I process complex emotions around my own embodiment as a woman of color, as someone who lives with chronic health conditions as well. And my characters are often quite desperate to find ways of empowering themselves when their bodies let them down, so to speak. And they look for ways to reframe the relationship they have with their bodies, particularly post-diagnosis of an illness. So for me, writing creates a sense of detachment so that I can process some of the heavier emotions like fear and shame and vulnerability when I think about my own relationship with my body. And I know that I'm speaking about my body as if it's separate from me, but I very much don't see the mind body as being separate binaries. I think that that feeling of separation comes when we just feel disconnected from the whole of who we are. And I'm also interested in looking at the ways social and institutional structures either empower or oppress our bodies. Even before we're born, our bodies are marked with labels, whether they're labels of gender, of race, of ability, disability, class. And these markers of identity and their intersections are either empowered or oppressed in social structures. So the body for me is far from being just this biological matter that we carry around with us. And finally, I've always been really interested in philosophical questions around identity. Who are we really? And I don't think it's possible to answer that fully without looking closely at the body. And fiction is just brilliant because you can take a theoretical approach and sort of test it like a case study. Because through character and story, you can often come to find new insights when you're looking at a theoretical idea. You can push the boundaries in a way that might not be quite possible in academic text. And that's why I think we see a lot of philosophers, like, for instance, Camus, who also wrote fiction. He wrote The Stranger, because the story and the metaphor allows for new insights to develop, and you can push the boundaries a bit further.
Wow. Have you found ever when you were writing that there was a particular thing that you thought fiction is really allowing me to explore this aspect, like more than maybe the more academic writing? Was there anything in particular that you were like, wow, this is the right way to be exploring that?
Yeah, for me, it was the emotional side of
The
embodiment.
emotional side.
So feeling shame or
Mm,
vulnerable, it just, it's a way, yeah, for me, it just, you can push it a lot further than an academic text to inhabit
yeah,
another character. And it's brilliant because you're not necessarily the character. You can, like I said, detach a bit and sort
detached.
of approach these heavy emotions and look where it was maybe not possible to look before.
Mm. It's
Mm.
fascinating. And I think this year in particular, a lot of us can really relate to feeling vulnerable in our bodies and maybe even just being more aware, of our bodies
Yeah.
given the situation. I don't need to say the situation, we all know what it is. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to how your characters cope with the process with feeling vulnerable in their bodies. Yeah. And how they
Yeah.
process those feelings.
Brilliant. Yeah. So in my debut novel, Out of Touch, the character of Ava is actually struck down by a car at the very beginning of the book, and she sustains quite serious injuries to her tibia and pelvic bone. And initially, she feels estrangement from herself, and the feeling is almost exasperated when the doctor comes in and explains her injuries to her, and he uses the demonstrative. So he says, the tibia, the pelvis. And there's a moment where Ava really reflects on that and how she actually does feel like it's not her body, that she feels detached from herself. And I think often when there is injury or illness that strikes us, there's an initial shock and a feeling of disorientation, of, again, feeling like there's a binary between maybe the mind and body. Um, I know, like, when I was diagnosed with cardiomyopathy, which is a heart condition, just as Ava is later on in the book, there is a sense of almost even feeling betrayed at the start. There's this thing happening inside of you, and you didn't know it, and this disconnect just it just, yeah. So it's sort of like a shock and a disconnect at the start. And the sense of uncertainty and fear, which follows a diagnosis, is also there in my short story, Not Contagious, where the main character, Homa, who also, like me, suffers from endometriosis, is afraid that the endometrial cyst in her right ovary will someday rupture and cause a septic infection. And she's afraid that rigorous sex will cause this rupture. And so, yes, it's really difficult to be intimate with someone. But in both cases, in the short story and the novel, there is a desire within the characters to reclaim a sense of control over their bodies. And one of the ways my characters renegotiate the relationship they have with their bodies is through intimacy and touch. And so Ava pursues a lot of sexual encounters, and Homa, the character in Not Contagious, because she's weary of sex and is afraid that it will, rupture her cyst, she solicits the services of a professional cuddler, which actually does exist. It's basically you pay for someone to give you platonic touch, to hug you and to touch you. And we know how important touch is. There's a lot of studies on the benefits of it, with the well-being that it gives us and the good feeling hormones. But then what happens when touch is withheld from us and it's impossible because of social distancing restrictions? What do we turn to? And that's when my interest and fascination with the New Age movement really comes in. So for a bit of context, the New Age movement is an ideology wherein you use your mind to essentially attract things into your life. So it's almost that belief of mind over matter, that by thinking positive, you can bring positive things into your life. So I can heal myself, for instance, sort of like some of the religions that we're familiar with. And I'm quite critical of the New Thought movement in my work, because it can sort of put us in a situation where we think, well, if I attract everything into my life, because another term that's often associated with the New Age movement is the law of attraction or manifesting. So if everything is attracted into your life because of your thoughts, then does that mean that you have actually caused your own illness through negative thinking? And sort of these are the questions that I grapple with in Out of Touch, but also in my next novel. And all because we're trying to gain a sense of control and agency over our bodies when we feel that they are broken in a way.
Yeah. Wow, so many themes that you're touching on in your work that just seems so relevant for I think so many people right now that they're
Mm.
thinking about. I'm really it's kind of amazing that you wrote this Not Contagious in 2019. So thinking about kind of even before, the pandemic throwing us into this heightened sense of our bodies, you're already really exploring all of these topics. You've already talked about this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could tell us kind of why you chose to write about the subject of contagion
Mm.
particular in that piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So even before the pandemic, I suppose I could be called a bit of a hypochondriac. I was always hyper aware of disease and illness, so that when the winter season, came, I would often take my own cutlery into places like fast food places like Leon's, because I couldn't bear the thought of, you know, someone else having touched perhaps the head of the fork that I would be eating from. So contagion has been on my mind for quite some time, in that sense. But also, I'm fascinated with contagion as it relates to identity. So contagion disrupts our Western notion of identity as being singular and separate. um, it disrupts the idea that the body is impermeable, right? We put up a lot of barriers in society, us versus them. We turn groups of people into the other. But if we've learned anything in the past year, is that the boundaries between you and I are not as separate at all as we think they are. And the idea of permeability, it generally can unsettle us, because again, it disrupts this idea of being singular and separate entity. Margaret Shildrick, who is a professor of gender studies, has written 2 wonderful books on this subject. And I think one of them is called Leaky Bodies and Boundaries, and the other Embodying the Monster. And she discusses even how fluid, like menstruation, has traditionally inspired abject disgust, because it disturbs, again, this notion of an impermeable body as being clean and proper and separate. So yeah, contagion has been on my mind for a long time, as I've also read these sort of more theoretical academic texts. And another thing about contagion is that, I mean, it can often be invisible, right? So like what we're seeing now, we just don't know. There's this fear about when it will strike. Is it on the glass that I'm about to drink out of, the virus? So yes, it's fascinating, really, as a subject.
Absolutely, absolutely. And something else kind of going a little bit further with that, kind of thinking about the medical theme, is that doctors in your work often do feature in your work as being quite dismissive. So I was
Mm.
curious about if this, representation stems from any kind of personal experiences or anything you'd like to talk about there.
Yeah, I mean, I've had some great doctors in the past, but sadly, I've also experienced this feeling of being dismissed. It took, I think, over 9 years going back and forth to the doctors to be taken seriously about my pelvic pain, and at last to receive that diagnosis of endometriosis. And this is quite a common experience for women who do suffer from endometriosis. It takes ages to actually get the diagnosis, because we're told, oh, it's just a bit of period pain. And it can be really frustrating and even create a sense of distrust. You begin to doubt your own body and what it's communicating with you. And so the doctor in this scenario holds a lot of power. And we know there are studies which show that women of color in particular are, some of their complaints are not taken as seriously. So the more we write about these things, the more we talk about these things, I think, about unconscious bias like that, then we can hopefully implement change to the healthcare system.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about things like topics like, menstruation. I mean, even now it is something that a lot of people, feel maybe don't even have the language to talk about because it's not really talked about. It's not really discussed, so much. So
Mm,
starting to approach those topics and those things in fiction, giving words to some of those experiences, I think is so it's so important because it's something that so many individuals experience, and it's
absolutely.
different for every person, but it's a part of a lot of people's lives, so that's I think that is fantastic that you're delving into those things. Absolutely.
Definitely. We need to, like you said, normalize this kind of language. I mean, it's life, it's our bodies, and we need to take the sense of shame that has been like placed on us out of the equation, and really talk in an open, honest way, because there's nothing to be ashamed about. It's natural, it's our bodies.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thinking, kind of going a little bit back to where we're at right now, and thinking about technology and social
Mm.
media, like we're talking virtually, and
Yeah.
all of you have joined us here virtually. So, I think that technology and social media has had a really profound effect on how we relate to others, but also to ourselves. We can kind of be together on screen, but we're not physically together. We can curate our image on social media. So I was wondering, how do you think about these advances and how they relate to the relationship we have with our bodies? Because it
Mm.
really is a new kind of frontier in a sense. Like
Mm.
how, yeah, well, yeah, what do you think about that?
That's a great question. I mean, on the one hand, it's been really useful to have this technology because we are staying connected through this pandemic. But I do think something does get lost when we're not in the same room together. Sort of, there's this vibing off of each other's body languages that I think it is an important thing. I'm also, just, this might seem like a bit of a sidestep, but I'm also really fascinated with this idea of VR and gaming, and whether it's possible in this way to almost disembody through technology. But even when we're fully immersed, let's say in our screens, there is still the perceiver, who is doing the gaming. And for me, the perceiver, or the consciousness, if you want to call it, cannot be separated from the body. You can't untangle it, because the perceiver is still the one who has gone out and who has experienced life, carrying different markers of identities with them. So even when you are VRing and in the gaming world, I think you cannot ever fully disembody. I digress here, but in terms of things like what we're seeing with Instagram, with airbrushing and filters on photographs and curating an image of ourselves, I think, this is an area we need to really think about more carefully, especially with young, impressionable people. I used to be a teacher for many years, for instance. And just as I was leaving, we were starting to talk about online footprint with students, which I think is really positive, and self image. And, we do need to consider the relationship we have with our bodies when we can alter them so dramatically through programs like airbrushing. Um, I actually went before the pandemic. I don't know if anyone else has been to an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery. It was Cindy Sherman's retrospective. She's an amazing photographer. And basically, within this exhibition, there were hundreds of self-portraits that she took of herself, where she's disguised and she almost embodies different characters. And for
Wow.
me, coming out of that, it just felt like a whiplash. And it was so disorienting, but also fascinating, because it made me think about, what does it mean to curate your own identity like we're doing online now? I'm not sure I've come to any conclusions, but it's definitely, put that question in my mind. Who is really the real you? Is it the person who's online, or is it is it a combination of, I don't know. It's a fascinating question to me. And I think technology is something that we definitely need to talk about more as it relates to body, and just be and the experience of embodiment.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when like these different platforms give us, different ways to kind of, yeah, create different little selves in different places. I do think that's so it is a unique thing for the people living now to be thinking about. I think that it is a really, really interesting time in that regard. Absolutely. I wanted to move on a little bit to talk a little bit about your experience just of writing, like focusing on writing the body. One of the things I was wondering is how your experience as a woman of color has informed your writing on the body, in particular, your own lived
Hmm.
experience.
Sure. So, I mean, when I step into a room and I'm not the only white person in it, it's something I'm very aware of, especially when I leave London and I visit, let's say, my in-laws who live in the Midlands. I'm very aware of being the only non-white person in the room at times. And I was born in Montreal in Canada. And where I lived at the time, it was quite culturally diverse. And the school I went to was really culturally diverse. And I didn't feel particularly different. It wasn't until I moved to a small town in Ontario, the English speaking province, when I began to notice that I was almost different. I felt very much ostracized in school. There was bullying, the smell of my clothes because of my mother's cooking, or the hair on my arms and legs. And that comes through in my writing, the feeling of shame almost around body hair, trying to pluck and shave and laser, the goal always to sort of remove the hair from the root, to try and blend in. And so I suppose I'm sensitive to difference, and I can feel quite aware of it, of the experience, because of the experiences of prejudice or just flat out racism that I've been through. I think there is a line we need to draw, though, between acknowledging difference, so how intersections of identity mean that we have varied experiences, and then reducing a person to such markers. Just to give you an example, I have a friend who's an author, and she wears a hijab, and she often receives books to quote from editors. And the thing is, she almost exclusively, receives books from Muslim authors, and of course, she wants to boost their voices. Yes, but at the same time, she would like to receive books from also non-Muslim authors. And I think the frustration stems from being reduced to a category because she wears hijab. Yeah.
Yeah, to that one thing rather than all her vast, I'm sure, other thematic and interests as well. Absolutely.
Mm.
And I was wondering what advice you would have to give to writers who are writing characters of color, or really any characters whose identities they themselves don't embody, which is, I think, something that a lot of writers can kind of relate to. So yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most important thing is to, first of all, inform yourself on the wider context around what it means to write from a marginalized perspective. So that includes looking into why it's important to boost authors from marginalized background and their stories, because they're traditionally underrepresented in publishing. And when they are published, often they can be underpaid, and so not given the same opportunities for publicity. And without the proper publicity and marketing push, often books don't have a chance to flourish in the same ways. So an important question to ask is, why am I wanting to write from this perspective? And in the past, when I run creative writing workshops, I've had people tell me, well, because I don't want all the characters in my books to be white. And I think that makes a lot of sense, to have to be inclusive. And so I can understand that motivation. And again, here, I think it's all really about doing the research and informing yourself on intersectional identities. Later on, I can recommend some resources. You can also hire sensitivity readers. So someone who embodies the perspective can look over your work, and also reading fiction from the perspective that you wish to write from. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's really useful. And I was wondering if there were any kind of common stereotypes or tropes that you see in writing about bodies in particular. So yeah, just curious, going back a little bit to our focus on bodies. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think whenever we reduce a character to their physical attributes, then we're treading on fairly shaky ground, particularly if these attributes have historically been used to shame or humiliate or vilify a group. For instance, using food to describe the skin tone of people of color is something I would discourage, because historically we have seen this sort of fetishism. And tropes can happen more often than we think. For instance, I absolutely love the author Carol Shields. I think she was one of the best contemporary writers. But even in her work, I'm thinking specifically of the Stone Diaries. The character of Mercy is sadly reduced to her weight, and almost every description is about her being overweight, and it's done in a way that's almost driving towards a punchline. So there is that. And there's been a lot of examples, obviously, in social media about men writing women poorly, effectively reducing them to their genitals. Someone entering a room and their breasts stand eager and at attention. But, but of course, there are also a lot of male writers who write women really well, like Colm Tóibín, I hope I said that right, the Irish author. And I just think, as a general rule about writing any character, just write a full human being. And that means, you have that compassion within you to look beyond one facet of what it means to be human. And so things like the token colored friend with no story of their own is something that we absolutely need to just stop doing. And any character should really be a breathing, living human being, as they go about their day-to-day lives. They might think about love, shopping, work, children, responsibility, sex. And speaking of sex, because we're on the topic, I want to say that this is an area where writers often, feel uncertain about how to proceed. Because, sex is complex. There are a lot of emotions that accompany it, from desire to maybe estrangement and fear and trauma, all depending on the context. And I think this is a good place to make a few recommendations if you're looking for authors who write sex really well. Leonie Ross is brilliant, and her short story collection, Come Let Us Sing Anyway, is great. And Carmen Macchio, whose short story collection, Her Body and Other Parts, it's just a masterclass in exploring the body and power. And Catherine Angel, who writes the nonfiction book Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, is a really nuanced analysis on female desire and consent and sexuality. Sorry, I deviated a bit from the original question, but there we
No,
go.
that's
There we
fine.
are.
No, that's really fascinating. And I'm glad that you deviated a little bit, because yeah, we have to talk about sex when talking about the body. Absolutely. And I think those are really, it's really good recommendations, because I think, I do know that there's a lot of writers have been attending the festival, which is wonderful. So I'm hoping that those recommendations are I know that they'll be useful for some of the attendees today. I think that it's really great to have these good examples, absolutely, to look to for inspiration, really. I mean, do you have any other recommendations for fiction or nonfiction reading which focus on the body in particular? Just because I think that would be really great to share if you have any.
Yeah, so I've got a few things. If you want to read up about intersectional identity, which I think you should, it's brilliant to get more information on it. I mean, Kimberly Crenshaw first coined the term intersectional identity, and she has a large body of work on the subject. Sway by Dr. Pragya Agarwal, who was originally supposed to chair the talk. She has her book Sway, which is brilliantly researched, and it highlights how unconscious bias still very much exists in social and institutional structures. Roxane Gay's memoir Hunger is a great account on what it's like to live as an overweight woman of color in a society which idolizes sort of slim white bodies. For sort of academic texts, I moved rooms because my internet connection was not great. I had the book to show you, but it's upstairs now. But anyhow, there is this brilliant anthology or collection of essays called Resistance in Vulnerability, which I highly recommend. And it's been edited by Judith Butler and a few others. And it's a collection of essays about how the body can actually be a site of empowerment, even when we feel vulnerable in it. Because when we come together, let's say, to protest, then the collection of marginalized bodies means that they can't be ignored anymore. So we're subverting society's idea of what the normative body should be. Recently, another book, sorry, I'm going on, there's quite a few recommendations. Recently, Leonie Ross actually recommended a brilliant book called Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia by Sabrina Strings. And I've started reading it, and it's really great. It gives a historical account of body representation and how in the Renaissance, actually having a full figure was seen as being quite healthy, and it was seen as a beautiful body. And she kind of traces that and shows through religion how sort of that changed, and now it's seen quite differently, and she ties it in with race. So those are just a few examples of books that I find have really helped me in exploring the body sort of with more nuance and detail.
That's great. I tried to get a couple of them down in the chat. So I wrote a few of those as you were saying them down, because we had someone in the chat saying if you could write some of them down.
Yes, I can. I can actually provide the list if that would be helpful to anyone.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that would be great. Yeah, I think I like too that was a list of, you have memoir, nonfiction, some fiction. It's nice to get all these different approaches and all these different kind of angles to it as well, because those different genres have different kind of goals and audiences and stuff. So it's interesting
Exactly.
to see these different ways of approaching it, for sure. Yeah, I wrote down a couple of them, but yeah, if you could share them, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. And there's one more that's really great. It's Lisa Blackman wrote a book. I think it's just called The Body. I will look into that again. But it's basically looking at different approaches to examining the body. So whether that's from like a humanist perspective, or from certain feminist theory, or looking at it from sort of what the medical sciences are saying about the body. So it's really interesting to have all of these different approaches so that you have like a full picture of what people are saying about the body. I find academic texts really helpful in sort of progressing my own thoughts on the subject.
Absolutely. And there's so much there. I mean, we've definitely like delved into so many different elements, but the body is it is such a massive topic. And I do think that, recommending these academic texts is wonderful, because it gives different ways, different approaches for people to think about these different aspects, because there's so many avenues and so many, sometimes wonderful, sometimes fraught kind of aspects of that. So great to get all these different avenues for exploration.
Absolutely. And can I just add something else? Sorry. One of the recommendations I gave was Judith Butler's, the collection of essays she edited called Vulnerability and Resistance. And I just wanted to say something about vulnerability here as it relates to storytelling. I think that often we prefer stories of triumph over tragedy. Sort of this idea that, a character encounters adversity and then struggles but overcomes ultimately. And, it is a very popular narrative arc because it's quite satisfying. At the same time, when I think about the body at times, I am critical of that as being sort of a dominant narrative that we sort of even we do enforce in society through self-help culture as well, this idea of overcoming vulnerability, because people with chronic health conditions, for instance, they don't necessarily always see an end in sight. And when you're in the midst of pain, to feel like someone is saying overcome this thing can feel quite demoralizing. So I think that a healthier relationship with vulnerability is perhaps just in accepting it and actually seeing that it can be empowering if you feel comfortable to share that experience with others. As I'm part of different groups. I'm part of like a group that, for instance, is the cardiomyopathy group in the UK, and people share the experiences they have with their bodies, and you don't feel alone in your illness. And that is something that can happen when something strikes your body, this sense of not only estrangement from yourself, but from other people as well.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, obviously every body is unique, but I think
Yes.
that just that experience of the vulnerability, pretty much everyone can probably relate to that feeling as well,
Yeah.
in different ways. So I think that that's a fantastic kind of suggestion. Absolutely. Just getting connected as well, you know, with others, finding that community, maybe with people that have experiencing similar things in their bodies. So absolutely. Wow, wonderful suggestion. I'm conscious that we might want to move on to the Q&A to see if the audience has any questions as well. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we kind of open it up for audience Q&A?
I don't think so. I think, again, like you said, everyone has a unique relationship with their own body, and there is no right way to do it. And if anything, I encourage people to sort of explore the relationship they have with their own bodies. And I understand that sometimes that could be difficult to look at. And that's why sometimes fiction is wonderful for that, because you can look at something that would otherwise be really difficult to process, and there is a bit of distance. So you can look at those complex emotions. Yeah,
absolutely. And yeah, definitely. No, I think that makes so much sense. And also just kind of momentarily sort of from a distance see another body and kind of have that empathy as well, you know, how someone else lives and moves through the world. And I think it's a great thing. We're getting so many good recommendations. Other people are adding in the chat their suggestions of titles and things that they've read and enjoyed. So that's wonderful. Thanks. We did the last one I see here is Lynn has recommended Constellations by Sinead Gleason.
Brilliant.
So many great recommendations. So everyone be sure to have a look in the chat if you've not already. I'll go ahead and open it up for the Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to pop it in the Q&A box. I see that we've got one question already. So everyone, feel free to direct your questions there just so we'll be able to see them. It's a bit easier than having them in the chat. We can kind of pull them out from the Q&A. So we've got one question here so far. And this is someone who's asking about their partner is actually currently going through a diagnosis of endometriosis, and they're wondering if you have any tips or suggestions on like how to support that person going through it.
Yeah, it is really difficult, particularly if it's been going on for a while, the symptoms without the treatment, without the recognition that there might be something else going on. My partner, he's just been incredibly supportive by just sort of being there and listening, not necessarily offering advice. I mean, he is a problem. He likes to solve problems, but he's also really good at listening and being empathetic. And I think that often just being seen, especially if you don't feel like you're being seen by the doctors because they're it's in and out, just being there as in listening and taking it in is already huge. I once bought a book. It was about endometriosis. There are some recommendations about centers specifically that treat endometriosis as part of the NHS. I don't want to give medical advice out here because I'm not a doctor.
It's an author talk. We know this we have an author here, not a doctor.
But it makes sense because so in effect, I know if you're in London, the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital does have a specific clinic dedicated to endometriosis, which is sometimes, they've got all the equipment to test, etc. Like an MRI machine can sometimes pick up things that a transvaginal scan wouldn't. Okay. I don't know if that was too specific, but
no,
I know it's hard, and really I feel for you. It is a difficult thing.
Yeah, thank you for that question. We have a
Yeah,
couple
thank
other
you.
questions coming in now. So we've got a question from Alyssa. So Alyssa is saying, sometimes as a chronically ill person, I think about what it would be like to swap bodies with someone who is healthy. What would I gain and what would I lose? Then playing with a
Yeah.
story about this. Are there any themes or tricky places you'd expect to be addressed in a story about an ill person temporarily in a well body? An interesting question. Thank you,
Wow.
Alyssa.
That is so interesting. And I've never thought about it before, except that so I meditate on a daily basis. And in my meditations, I do try and sort of conjure the feeling of well being and almost like creative visualization, and to the point where, like, let's say I could be pain free and it's incredible. In terms of translating that into a story and then seeing sort of sensitive areas, you know what, just do it, just have a go. You could never know until you actually go there about what will come up. So my, yeah, I guess my advice would be to just see what happens, see what kind of emotions come up for yourself, where you feel the discomfort. And you know, if you have people that you trust, like beta readers, maybe you would share the work with them to get the feedback. um, but yeah, it's a brilliant question. I'll be thinking about it even after this talk. I might come back to it as well. Yeah, thank you. Do you have anything, sort of any suggestions there? Because it's really made me think that.
Yeah, feel free, Alyssa, to pop in the chat if you have any more thoughts on that. That is, yeah, really, thank you for that question. We've got another question from Lynn, who's asking, where would you go for research on experiences of illnesses? I'm conscious of not wanting to use medical only texts for info. Any ideas?
Mm. There is a book that I'm thinking about. I think it's a memoir. Yeah, it's a by Porchester. It's called Sick, I believe, or I'm probably getting the title wrong, but it's a memoir about her experience with, I think, I mean, I could be completely wrong because it's been ages since I've looked at it. Um, where she does describe this experience of trying to get diagnosed for ages, and I think that's a really common experience, actually, with people with chronic conditions that are not so clear. It is that sort of being unsure, and almost creating a sense of distrust in your own body because you've tried, you've gone to the doctors, and nothing is really clear, and the confusion versus the clarity can really wreak havoc on your mental health. I know it caused a lot of anxiety for myself, and it was almost like a sense of relief when you get the diagnosis, because you think, oh well, this is what it is. I can name the thing. I can feel like, it's not just me imagining it. I'm sorry, I think I've lost track of the
Oh,
original question.
oh, no, that's fine.
Sometimes when I speak, I just, yeah, sorry. Have I answered the original question? What was this?
Yeah, it was just conscious of not wanting to use only kind of medical text. So just
Right. So there's
ideas for, yeah,
memoirs. Absolutely.
memoirs.
So
Yeah,
there's a few
absolutely.
memoirs out
Absolutely.
there. I'm trying to think. Oh, a really good novel, which I read a few years ago. Deborah Levy wrote Hot Milk. And it's a brilliant story of a mother and daughter. And the mother, I think she has issues with walking, her legs, and the daughter thinks it's all in her head. And so there is, they go to Spain, I think, ultimately to try and get a diagnosis. And it's a brilliant, brilliant account of how physical illness also can relate to mental illness, how the two are interconnected, and and the whole process of getting a diagnosis. If you want to see a great example in fiction, again, Deborah Levy's Hot Milk is brilliant. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. So do we have any other questions? Oh, great. We've got one from Holly. Holly asks, historically, I use a strong ability to compartmentalize in order to deal with my issues with ill health and diagnosis,
Mm,
which definitely leads to
yeah.
a disconnect between my body and self. In
Yeah.
terms of writing, did you have to overcome this sense of disconnect? And if so, how did you get past that to really dig into those feelings in order to write
Yeah.
from a deeper personal perspective?
That is so, yeah, that's brilliant. And it's so true. I did the same, because you have to try and put it away, because otherwise it could really overpower you. And I suppose I'm thinking back to when I wrote Out of Touch, and Not Contagious. And I think just the very process of it being a story, of it being a different character who isn't me, really did help me um, sort of emotionally stay centered. Yeah. But also, I am able to reach further depths of my emotions, because again, it's not me. Although I'm writing it, it's this particular character in this scenario. And that's how I went about the process. But at the same time, for me, meditation is such an important part of my writing process. It keeps me stable in so many ways, not just with sort of all the chronic illnesses, but also because being a writer is really tough. There's so many things that come up, whether it's criticism, or just feeling like you're not producing. So I had to develop a practice to sort of anchor me. And that anchoring has also helped in terms of how I deal with the chronic illnesses. Yeah. So I think it just, through the very fact that you're, let's say, fictionalizing, it's helped. I know people who write nonfiction about heavy things like disease and illness. They do need to take breaks often, because it can be really intense to unleash. It's basically like a trauma in some ways, isn't it? And if you're able to also at the same time, maybe you want to have a, speak to a therapist. I mean, I've had therapists over the years to help me deal with these emotions, and I found it very useful personally. Yeah.
That's a lot of really, really great suggestions and very, very practical as well. I appreciate you kind of sharing that, pulling back the curtain too of your writing process with the
Mm.
meditation and these things. Cause I think a lot of times people only see, the finished product and the finished,
Oh.
book,
Mm.
and it's, it is hard to write a book, and it's fascinating to hear, yeah, these tools that you use to kind of keep yourself anchored, as you said, the meditation being something that's fantastic.
Absolutely. And it doesn't stop. Like, you think, once I get the agent, once I get the publisher, once I get this, you're always moving the goalpost. So I needed to find a way. And, recently I've tried something new, where, because I spend a lot of time on social media, where I'm almost thinking, this is not the full me. And I have to almost separate the identity of who I am online with who I am outside, because it helps me, again, compartmentalize. I almost give myself like a pseudo identity, because I need that distance. Because, on social media, so many things can come up. um, and that's how I deal with it. It's almost like I've chosen to sort of have a fictional, but it is also me at the same time. I am being myself, but at the same time I compartmentalize by saying, this is the author identity, this is me.
Yeah.
It helps me to separate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that makes so much sense. And I think it's really, I think so many people do that. I think absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's fascinating to hear, definitely. And as you said, it's like these things are you, but it's, constructing, kind of going back what we were talking about earlier, constructing a
Yeah.
certain persona, for
Yeah.
certain contexts. And I think that everybody does that these days. So it's really fascinating to hear from, yeah, from an author's perspective, kind of do how that works online, and kind of managing that
Yeah.
with, balancing it with your private self as well, and having both of those. And yeah, it is an interesting time for sure. We've got another question from Lynn about another question: any do's and don'ts on using humor with illness slash body issues?
Uh, I use humor a lot in my work. And I suppose, and one of the authors I greatly admired, Laurie Moore, she uses dark humor in her work as well. And I find that, but she uses it in a way that almost helps her penetrate deeper into some of
Yeah.
these places where we're vulnerable, and it's really difficult to go. I find that she uses it so effectively, humor, so that we can explore it more without it seeming too heavy. And at the same time, we are thinking about these complex emotions and we're relating to them. So I personally think that as long as it's done, I mean, there's so many different humor in itself is a huge topic. You know, there's different types of humor, but as long as it's done compassionately and there's a purpose to it, then I think humor is brilliant for getting deeper into a topic, even as sensitive as illness. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Lori
That's
Moore
a
is
great
another.
question. Yeah.
That's another one that we can. I'll pop in the chat for anyone that hasn't checked out her work, because I think that she's so, the dark humor thing that you said, absolutely fantastic there. Great. So we've got that. And then let's see, we probably have time for another one or two questions. So I see we have a question here that is from someone who's writing a story about a teenage girl with like body dysmorphia and binge eating. You mentioned being careful about writing about someone who's overweight, and I wondered if you could be more specific on what to look out for. I'm writing from a position of knowing, but want to be careful doesn't come across as body shaming, which would be the opposite of what I'm trying to achieve. Yeah, so someone kind of in that writing process, you know, kind of dealing with some of those themes that we've touched on a little bit. But yeah, if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, though it's not particularly an area of expertise in terms of eating disorders, I would absolutely recommend, again, reading books such as Roxane Gay's Hunger is a brilliant resource, and the one that I recommended from Leonie Ross about fat phobia. I think, as a general rule, again, if you're being compassionate and the person is a facet of things, they're not just reduced to one thing, and they're a human being, then I think, you know, you're generally safe. But I would still, if you're feeling unsure, I might do a bit more reading, a bit more research, and potentially approach a sensitivity reader. Again, someone who is open and willing to look at your work, who might have experienced some of the things that you're writing about, and they can give you just another bit of sort of assurance. Yeah. I know it can be difficult. Even like myself, when I'm writing about being even Iranian, I sometimes feel like, am I giving the experience like a full, do you see what I mean? Am I doing this properly? Basically, it goes through my own mind, and it's just sometimes about getting the reassurance from someone else, but also in having confidence in what you've written. Yeah. So I feel sometimes even that I'm not sure if what I'm writing is good enough or accurate, even within my own identity, let's say. Yeah. But even within, like, let's say even I'm Iranian, but I'm second generation Iranian, and I've lived in Canada, and I come from a particular background. And this is why, again, identity is something really important to acknowledge the intersections of them. And the more we read about sort of intersectional identities, the more we understand about how it's not all the same. Not all Iranians have the same experience. Every person is different. And yeah, so as long as I think the person is a full living human being, then we're good. Sorry, I hope that helps.
No, that was great. And I think too, like, I love what you said about, you know, coming from that place of compassion and also just that full humanity, you know, keeping that full humanity at the forefront. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
I think we've got probably time for one more question. So we've got Jackie's asking about finding sensitivity readers. Yeah, just any thoughts you have on that at all, or that aspect of the writing process?
Absolutely. Apart from there are dedicated websites to this, but also social media I find really useful. I'm on Twitter a lot, and people do actually put call outs, like just put the question out there. Someone put my mad fat diary. Is that oh, sorry,
it might
that
be
might
a
be something
reading.
else.
Oh, no, I think it's another reading
Oh,
recommendation.
another reading
Actually,
record. Thank
yeah,
you.
I think Holly, you just sent that to the panelists. So if you want to send that to everyone, actually, I'll just, yeah, you have to send it to panelists and attendees. So if you want to send that to everyone else, yeah, sorry to
Sorry,
interrupt.
sorry, no.
No.
So I find social media so useful, and people are so generous with, even if they are not a sensitivity reader, they will retweet your request, and they'll recommend you to someone. So yeah, just putting the question out there can really be helpful. And there are specific websites as well dedicated to that. I don't have any off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
That's great. Thank you so much for all of your like the wisdom in answering all of these great questions. And I so appreciate you taking the time to come join us at the Stay at Home Festival. And I really hope that everyone had as great an experience as I did, yeah, learning from you and chatting with you. And thank you all for coming, and also for all of your fantastic questions as well. That was a really, really
Yes.
good session.
Can I just say, yeah, thank you so much, Carly, for chairing this at the last minute. I so appreciate it. It was great to get to know you. And the questions were absolutely brilliant. They really made me think more deeply about the body. So thank you all for joining. I really do appreciate it. Yeah.
All right, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.